Good evening and welcome to the Linnean Society, where Darwin's revolutionary paper on natural selection was read for the first time. The occasion passed without much notice. Well, the BBC has certainly remedied that. Tonight we examine what Darwin's theories tell us about ourselves. I'm joined by an international panel of pinnacles of evolution. Professor Steven Pinker, psychologist from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Meredith Small, anthropologist from Cornell University. Professor Steve Jones, biologist from University College London, and Dr. Jonathan Miller, neurologist and polymath. The issue tonight is, to what extent are we still under the shadow of natural selection? We're not concentrating on grand theories, but how far does evolution make its way into everyday life? Evolution is about success in reproduction and survival, so let's start with human reproduction. To what extent are our sexual desires determined by our evolutionary inheritance? Steven Pinker.
Well, I don't think people have sex for evolutionary reasons. They're not interested in propagating their genes. If they were, there'd be no such thing as contraception. On the other hand, if you ask the question, why is there sexual desire to begin with? Why do people get pleasure out of sex? I think evolution has everything to do with it. The fact that people would rather have sex than, say, bump foreheads or rub an elbow against a knee surely is related to the fact that sex leads to reproduction, whereas those other activities don't. More subtly, I think there are a number of features of sexuality that can be explained on the assumption that it is a way of sending genes into the next generation. The fact that people are attracted to other people who look as if they're fertile, who have the right body shape and size and the right age. The fact that there are...
So is it men attracted to, from your book, men attracted to a particular sort of women and vice versa?
And the difference between the sexes. In all societies, male sexuality and female sexuality are not equivalent. Roughly speaking, men have more of a tendency to go for quantity, women for quality, and it's surely no coincidence that a man who has sex with 50 women can have 50 times as many children. A woman who has sex with 50 men is not going to have 50 times as many children. So that biological fact and that behavioral fact presumably are related, and that's an example of how evolutionary theory helps explain some of the patterns of human sexual desire.
Would you go along with that, Steve?
Yes, I think so far so self-evident, really. I mean, I don't think we need Charles Darwin to tell us that old men need like young women and not necessarily the other way around. We did evolve, of course we evolved, and our lives are constrained by our past. But to say that actually isn't to say much more than to say that the reason pigs can't fly is that they descended from ancestors who didn't have wings. Now that's true, but it's not a very profound thing to say. And I do think there's been a terrible tendency in this debate about sexuality and many other things to overinterpret the obvious. So I think we should realize that we're unique in that although we have evolved, what's interesting about us has really stepped outside Darwin's theory. We've escaped from evolution in sex and many other things too.
Meredith Small.
Well, I'd just like to add that what humans do and what they say are two different things. So men may desire younger women, but in fact research shows that couples are made up of individuals that are about 3 years apart. Women may want men of high status or a lot of money, but pretty much we end up with who loves us or who wants us. So the desires can be very different from the actual fact of who you reproduce with.
Jonathan Miller.
And social class might also have something to do with it. I mean, it's quite clear that there must be some evolutionary explanation for the fact that pleasure is attached to this activity for which one otherwise might have to put an entry in one's diary to remind one to do it. And whenever pleasure is attached to a labor-intensive activity, it must be that there must at one time have been a selective advantage in doing it, and therefore some sort of selective advantage in attaching pleasure to it. But I think that there's, as Steve was saying, I think there probably is not much more to it than that we can say. What is interesting are the enormous varieties of human behavior which lie outside these biases. I mean, there must be some sort of bias which is genetically determined, which means that we still go on having sex. But also what is interesting about us is the enormous variety of our sexual conduct, which really has no effect on the amount of genes that we push into the next generation and beyond.
Steve?
I think that Steve wasn't quite being fair in saying that this is all just obvious and we don't need evolution to tell us this. It's obvious now because of the evolutionary theory that had become well known 20 years ago. But up till then, and indeed today, at present times, there are many people who say that men's desire for a variety of sexual partners is just due to the influence of James Bond and is a culturally local phenomenon and wouldn't be found in other cultures, which turns out to be false. Many people would say that with the feminist revolution, that asymmetry will vanish, and recent studies have shown that it has not vanished. Similarly, the study of the correlation between tastes for sexually attractive bodies and fertility would not have been dreamed of without the Darwinian analysis. Even a few years ago, people would have said, well, you can't quantify beauty. It varies capriciously from culture to culture, and it has nothing to do with biology.
Can I bring in Meredith Small here? Because something that Steven Pinker said on the way through implied that men were necessarily more promiscuous than women. And in your book, insofar as I read it correctly, that's one of the points you take on, don't you?
Yes, work by Robin Baker has highlighted several biological features of women that suggest that women may be designed to be interested in multiple partners. And we can't just say this is a provenience of males, and it may be the heavy hand of culture that stops women, and in various cultures, from having multiple partners. And again, what women say they like or say what they're doing and what they're really doing are two different things.
What do you think about this basic? Is there a basic difference?
Well, there must be some sort of biological bias. I mean, it's like the bias that exists in a bowl. And there are these genes which constitute the bias, and they turn things in certain directions. And the directions you've mentioned, and the particular sort of partners that are favoured. The fact that sexual activity is undertaken at all with the sort of energy and expenditure that it is indicates that it must be biologically determined in some way.
Well, is it biologically determined? Because what Meredith Small has been saying is, look, this is culturally determined. Women have been given a subservient role in many cultures, and they've even been given a subservient role, if you forgive the pun, in sex.
Why do we have to be exclusive about it? I mean, the whole point of it is that we are, in fact, these amphibious creatures distributed halfway between a culture, which is best described in cultural terms, and our genetic inheritance, which is best described in genetic terms. But it somehow always comes down to some sort of ideological struggle in which you have to choose partners, and you have to decide whether you're going to be a biologist or whether you're going to be a cultural analyst. Now, some people say that it's absurd and sort of limp-wristed and hand-waving to use cultural analysis, and that finally that the biological truths are the only ones which can be tested, and therefore the only ones which can possibly be true in any interesting way. And this is rank nonsense. I mean, it's quite clear that there is a sort of anamorphic distortion of something which in animals is determined entirely genetically, because it's refracted through a very complicated medium of culture, which actually spreads the beam of genetic effects across a very, very wide area, which simply doesn't occur with animals that don't have the sort of developing culture that we have.
Do you think that pair bonding, which you again have written about, is something that is essential in the evolution of Homo sapiens sapiens as is happening now?
The answer is sort of interesting, because I used to believe that. I used to make the statement that pair bonding in humans is as hardwired as bipedalism. And then in an audience much like this, standing up, making that statement, I had a social anthropologist very kindly correct me, saying that in the people that she studies in South America, although they are married and they do have sex, they lead completely separate lives. They have different friends, they don't sleep in the same bed, they don't eat meals together. They are not what we would consider in Western culture pair bonded. So it calls to question, are we naturally pair bonded? My first reaction is yes, we always like to find someone to be with, but perhaps that's not a universal feature of humans.
Do you think pair bonding is an evolutionary development, Steve Jones?
I think in the broader sense, yes. I mean, given that we have infants who are tremendously dependent, I think the argument that it's necessary to have two individuals looking after that infant...
3 is better.
3 is better.
Or 4.
Yeah. Probably has some weight, yes. I mean, I don't think, as Jonathan Miller says, I think it's silly to deny the involvement of evolution and genetics in things like pair bonding. I don't think any of us do. We're much less pair bonded than, say, the kittiwake is, that nice little bird that flies around. But to know that doesn't alter my attitude towards human behaviour very much. It's also the case, if you look...
Well, the attitude to human behaviour is... Our society for a long time, and still is, was based on pair bonding being the absolute, being the given. This is what people must do. It wasn't only the ideal, it was the compelled ideal if you're going to produce children. That has begun to break down quite spectacularly recently, hasn't it?
It depended on social class. I mean, no one ever talks about the biology of nannies. and about the fact that large groups of society actually use a third person to do most of the caring and bonding indeed. And in fact, in aristocratic families and people who have enough money, the child is bonded much more to the nanny than it is to the biological mother. Now, the fact is that a cultural analysis is required in order to explain the differences in various communities that decide to live together in certain ways, rear their children in certain ways, distribute the care of children in certain ways, and it's a cultural matter and not a biological one.
Well, on the other hand, taking what Jonathan says on board, is there anything about our evolutionary past that indicates the way that we are going in the business of living together to produce children? Are we going to live together to produce children and then separate, or is there anything along the way over the last few thousand years?
Well, I think the key thing is to acknowledge the role of culture, but not to treat it as some autonomous force, some surrounding gas or some force like gravity that just magically causes people to behave. That culture is itself a set of neural mechanisms, a set of biases to pay attention to some things and not others, to draw certain conclusions from other people's behavior and not others, and that changing social structures come from shifting opportunities, probably given a constant set of human desires. So there is a desire for sex, there's a desire to have your babies survive and do well, there's also a desire not to do more work than you have to do. If you're in a society where you can achieve all three of them at the same time by hiring nannies or slaves or as whatever is available, then you'll have a different social structure. But those different social structures aren't really in opposition to the idea that we have an evolved psychology. It's simply that the same set of emotions can be manifested in different ways depending on the situation of others around us.
Steve Jones.
There's a problem with this kind of argument, which is that it becomes a sort of anti-science, and the evolution then becomes like a sofa which molds itself to the buttocks of anybody who happens to sit on it. So what you've now got is a situation where you can explain all conceivable patterns of human behavior in evolutionary terms, and that means that you no longer have an experiment to do, an observation to make, which could disprove it. I mean, I read the other day, to my astonishment, that by the year 2010, more than half of all mothers in Britain will be stepmothers. So they will not be genetically related to the children they're looking after. Now, I haven't yet heard the evolutionary explanation of that shows it to be moulded by natural selection, but I'm well aware that within a few weeks or a few months there'll be a completely seamless explanation of it. And we're turning really not into evolutionists, but into theologians. We have this wonderful book.
No, I disagree with that, yeah. Because there's more than one outcome that's compatible with evolutionary theory doesn't mean that any outcome is. And I could give you any number that would just falsify the theory outright. If there was a society in which people were completely unconcerned about genealogy, if after a woman gave birth, several women gave birth, you could just randomly switch the babies around and mothers wouldn't care that they were raising theirs as opposed to someone else, I would say that refutes the theory.
Well, half of all mothers being stepmothers is getting some way along that road.
However, there's another prediction there that step relationships should not be equivalent to biological relationships psychologically, and indeed they're not. Daly and Wilson, testing a hypothesis that no one else had thought to look at, again on the basis of evolutionary theory, compared rates of child abuse for natural parents versus biological parents versus step parents, and found enormous differences.
100 to 1, wasn't it?
100 to 1.
Step mothers were 100 to 1 more likely to kill, actually, the children.
In the most extreme case. And indeed, the whole psychology of reconstituted families is one of how to cope with the antagonisms between stepchildren and step-parents. That's what the self-help industry on step-parenting is about. That's what the psychologists have to deal with when they see these people. So indeed, it's a prediction that could have gone the other way. It could be that people were completely indifferent to whether a child was theirs or not. That's not the way we're constituted.
There would be a feeling on a lot of people watching this program that evolution drives society forward fundamentally by creating more children to drive society forward, fundamentally to create more children to drive society forward. That's around in some people's minds. Now, one thing that gets in the way of that we've talked about is contraception. Another is the question of homosexuality.
Male homosexuality is around. It's always been around. The standard explanation, which was touted around, was that it had evolved because male homosexualities were